And welcome. You are listening to Watching the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. Today is October 4th, 2021, and what an October it's starting out to be. Evaporating trust in everything. Our good friend John Rubino is with us now, dollarcollapse.com. Again, any questions, comments, email us, kl@kerrylutz.com. So, John, everything is going down the toilet here at a rapid rate.
Hey, Kerry. Yeah, lots of stuff are going wrong. I think the theme that probably makes the most sense for putting all the stuff into context is a loss of trust, because so many things are happening now that a growing number of people are either perceiving as dishonest or incompetence out there. And the list is just growing, and more people are losing faith in the big systems, which is that's been one of the things that was always supposed to happen as we drift into bankruptcy and financial crisis. And now it looks like it's happening on a lot of different levels.
Buckminster Fuller foresaw everything that's happening now, and he was the one that always said, don't try to change the system, just leave the system, right?
I didn't know he said that, but he was a cool guy, Bucky Fuller. So yeah, that's a reasonable way to approach this.
Yeah, I think so. So when we look, we had like another disclosure. They were like similar to the disclosure from the Panamanian law firm about the way the world's wealthiest people avoid taxes and launder their money.
Yeah, and this was actually twice as big as the data dump that was the Panama Papers. And it includes a lot of, obviously a lot of rich people hiding assets and avoiding taxes by using offshore accounts, but also a lot of political leaders around the world. So this is going to reverberate, because it's a lot of people who really shouldn't be stealing and shouldn't be hiding their income and their assets, and yet they're doing it. And another interesting thing about this is that a lot of the places where they're doing it is kind of surprising. Like the US and big parts of Europe are now tax havens for people from other places. And even South Dakota in the US turned into some kind of a big tax haven for some reason. Yeah, the governor, who I think is a really good candidate for vice president in the next go around, has some explaining to do. She's going to have to.
I can tell you why it happened from a legal standpoint, because they passed a law about trusts. Like, trusts are really cool things, and if you're interested in trusts, you could always email me. But trusts are really interesting because they don't get registered with the government, except certain cases they need a taxpayer ID number. The document itself doesn't get filed anywhere. It's totally private. And even the name, you have wide discretion picking a name. So all these things considered, South Dakota, well, Delaware has been that kind of thing for many years. And look where our president came from. So a lot more shoes to drop there, because it's barely getting covered. And you wonder, who is letting out all this info? Who has access to it? And I wonder what politicians near and dear to our hearts have accounts and trusts all over the world that we know nothing about. Interesting to see. Well, New York is deploying the National Guard to replace 70,000 unvaccinated healthcare workers. This is madness.
Well, this might be the biggest outrage of everything we talked about today, and that's saying something, because there's a lot of outrageous things going on. But the story with New York is that basically New York's healthcare professionals spent a solid year unvaccinated and still treating people because the vaccinations weren't available for the first part of the pandemic. And now the government's coming back to them and saying, well, unless you get vaccinated, you're unsafe, so we're going to fire you. But think about this. If you spend a year in an ICU and you have no immune to new disease, of course you're going to get it, right? So most of these doctors and nurses and orderlies and everybody else probably have natural immunity, which is better than a vaccination. And yet the government of New York is still going to fire them if they refuse the vaccine. And that's going to create a huge shortage of healthcare professionals. And so now they're going to bring in, people from the National Guard that have some healthcare experience in their background. Maybe they're retired or they moved on and they're not registered anymore or whatever. But they're going to bring those people in to pick up the slack. Now, how crazy is that? The people they're firing already spent a solid year, and now they're going to be fired. So that just seems like the kind of thing that is going to create this huge groundswell of frustration and anger because it's so clearly stupid and so clearly motivated by something beyond just the welfare of patients, right? And probably what it is that natural immunity is being ignored by the governments of at least the U.S. and around the world also, because you don't make any money off natural immunity if you're big pharma, and big pharma is funding this whole show from beginning to end. But by the way, does that sound a little bit familiar? Because you and I spend a lot of time in finance talking about how the Fed created all of our problems, and then they come in and they're supposed to be the ones to fix the problems. The arsonist sets the fire and then comes in and puts the fire out and wants to be treated like a hero. Yeah, and now we've got big pharma kind of behaving the same way, and they totally own the political system. And that's why nobody's paying any attention to natural immunity that normally signify herd immunity. In other words, if 80% of the people, one way or another, have antibodies, that should be the end of the story. And it's not. And it's not even being talked about by the guys in charge. So this is a crazy story from beginning to end.
Hey, and if you saw that little debate between the head of Health and Human Services and Senator Rand Paul, it was definitely good for a few laughs and dealt exactly with what you're talking about. The idea that there's enough National Guards people, men, women, to actually take over for these 70,000 workers is absurd, because there is not. And especially ones that are qualified. Yes, they can pick up the garbage if they have to. They can do other stuff, but as far as treating sick people, I don't think that's going to work. And well, we won't mention the name of that certain health issue again, other than to say that their fact checker from Facebook is actually funded by a certain big pharma lobby. Who would have thunk it, huh?
Yeah, surprise, surprise. That was Kerry. You misstated, though. It's the independent fact checker.
Oh, the independent
at Facebook, who is actually funded by the pharmaceutical industry. It turns out. Yeah. See, now we don't trust. Well, not that we ever really trusted those guys, but now we absolutely should not be trusting them. Anybody who still believes fact checking that comes from an entity like Facebook's in-house independent fact-checking organization is just operating with their own agenda. You're consciously ignoring facts because they don't suit your preconceptions, and that I think is, well, in an ideal world that would be a shrinking number of people, but in the U.S. right now it seems like it's a growing number of people as opinions harden on both sides.
Craziness. Hey, so there's a Marine who spoke out, criticized the Afghan chaos. They threw him in the brig. Now $2.2 million has been raised for him to assist in his defense. It's pretty outrageous, but you're not supposed to criticize the commander-in-chief, no matter how badly he screws up.
Well, he knew that, and he consciously put his career and maybe his life on the line in order to speak out. So you got to respect the guy for that, because he wasn't that far from a really nice, cushy military pension. He had like 3 more years before he was going to be able to retire with a lifetime income. And he chose to speak out, which means this matters to him, and he feels like he's right. That this was by ending the Afghan war the way we did, rather than 19 years ago, like we should have, or this year, but correctly. The government is basically saying that all the people that died, all the people that devoted their lives to that occupation, did it pointlessly. You know, there was no reason for them to have done it because we're right back where we started. And yeah, you know, we really should have gone in there, tried to get Osama bin Laden, and when he went to Pakistan, we should have pulled out of Afghanistan. So it would have been a one-year thing, and over. And the Taliban would have been in charge after that, just as they are now. You know, so it would have been just like it is now. Yeah, yeah.
They're going to be overthrown at some point. It's silly to think they wouldn't have been. Now it'll be a lot longer because they got all that fancy American military equipment. But they would have been overthrown because everybody despised them. They ruled from fear. There was a viable resistance. They had, right before 9/11, they had killed off the main head of that resistance, the main warlord. And that's what actually paved the way for 9/11. But nobody looks at history. But you know what? You don't have to worry because you're probably not going to be celebrating Christmas this year anyway if one Dr. Fauci has his way, huh?
Yeah. So the guy in charge of our pandemic response is now saying that Christmas might not be allowed by the government. You know, they might very possibly come out with rules that say nobody more, you know, no more than 5 people can celebrate Christmas in the same place. In other words, taking a page from Australia's book, where they'll break down your door. They just this isn't on the list that you and I talked about beforehand, but did you see the Australia story about somebody tried to sneak a trunk load of Kentucky Fried Chicken into a neighborhood, and they caught him, and he went to jail for it because that was against the rules, because that would imply that there was some large gathering of people that was illegal. So you can go to jail for smuggling fast food now in Australia. Well, we're not all that far from that, at least in some of the really aggressive states. You know, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see California come up with a rule like that.
Yeah, no KFC for you. No KFC for you. Oh my God. Hey, well, hey, so Treasury's gonna get routed here, you think?
Okay, that's actually a very big deal. You know, that ties into trust to an extent, in the sense that when interest rates go up, what that is market participants saying, nah, we need a higher interest rate, a higher return before we will lend money to you. And that's starting to happen in the Treasury bond market, where the yields on US government debt are starting to rise in response to inflation. So market participants are basically saying, nah, you know, we don't want this stream of dollars that comes from these bonds unless we get a much bigger stream of dollars, because the dollar is depreciating at an accelerating rate, and we need to be compensated accordingly. So if that continues, in other words, if interest rates go up in the US, that has a disproportionate impact on the emerging markets where they borrowed a lot of dollars in order to fund either government operations or infrastructure, or you know, or corporations did it, or you know, lots of people in some place like Brazil borrows US dollars on the assumption that the dollar is going to go down in value, or its interest rates are going to stay very low, and that's going to make the transaction profitable. Well, if interest rates go up on US government debt, or on US debt in general, and anybody in Brazil has to roll over their dollar-denominated debt, that means they have to do it at a higher interest rate. In other words, they have to pay more in order to borrow. And that can blow a lot of these guys out of the water. You know, a lot of these countries are, they're already hurting because of the instability of the global financial markets of the last few years, along with the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. And now to have their dollar-denominated debt blow up on them might be the last straw for a lot of them. You know, you might see some more Venezuelas emerge among emerging markets, where the system just starts to spin out of control there, and their currencies just collapse, et cetera, et cetera. So this could be one of the catalysts, and it has been on the list of catalysts that might blow up the system for quite a while now. And an emerging markets crisis could be one of those things that at least contributes and maybe directly causes a broader financial crisis. So watch that and watch interest rates, and then see how it impacts on emerging markets. And we'll see how it goes.
Could be yet another black swan. Certainly, the energy prices are huge black swan that's been underappreciated, particularly rising, escalating natural gas prices. I haven't looked at it in a couple of hours, but it was hovering again at close to $6 per million BTUs, which everything runs on nat gas now. But this will be interesting to see. If we have a bad winter as well in the United States, we could be having similar problems here. Because you mentioned in Germany, they're out of coal and they're out of electric. And if they have a cold winter, can't even imagine what it's going to be like, John.
Well, see, that's what's so scary about this part of the story, is that all of these energy crisis kinds of things that are happening while the weather is still pretty nice. Let us have a colder than usual winter over the next 4 months. And these guys who are already kind of paralyzed by shortages and other kinds of problems, might have a lot more trouble than they have now, and it's already pretty troublesome. Speaking of the National Guard, the gas stations in Britain are running out of gas because they don't have enough drivers to deliver the gas. So they're bringing in the military to drive those trucks so that they don't have massive gas lines. There, again, another 1970s analogy there, where we had that in the 1970s, and it was part of what destabilized the financial system. And now we're seeing it again, and it might be spreading. A coal-fired plant closes in Germany, gas stations run out of gas in Britain. It goes on and on. There are similar problems percolating around the world. And it won't take that much for them to kind of coalesce into one gigantic energy crisis rather than a bunch of small localized ones.
Yep, I'm totally inclined to agree with you. This thing is out of control. And the intention of weaning us over from one energy source to another is all well and good in theory, but it's always the law of unintended consequences that does you in, and that's clearly what is happening here, right?
Well, in normal times, in other words, if the overall economy was healthy and we were seeing these kinds of energy things pop up, you'd think of it as just the growing pains of a transition. In other words, we're going to go to alternative energy sources and renewables, et cetera, over the next 20 or 30 years. That's pretty much baked into the cake. And it wouldn't be a surprise to see hiccups along the way, because it's a big transition. So if we were in pretty good shape otherwise and we saw this stuff, we'd go, oh, all right, this is not great, but we'll get through it. But we're in terrible shape otherwise. So these things can also be the kind of dominoes that start to fall. If you have an energy crisis where the cost of oil or gas or even coal spike, and that bankrupts a lot of different players out there and causes them to default on their debt and causes their banks to run into trouble and causes the governments of the world to have to bail out those banks. You get the potential for one of those cascades of problems that turn into something much, much bigger than the original crisis. So energy could be one of those things. And, as we talked about, it's still nice out. There are all these problems that are happening during good weather. So who knows what happens when it's below zero and there's a snowstorm.
Hey, John, between energy and food, this is going to be unbelievably bad. I always say it's been saying about energy and food, it's a triple whammy. With energy, you got government policies that discourage production of hydrocarbons. At the same time, you have government policies that encourage economic growth, which result in higher consumption of hydrocarbons. And then to top it all off, you got loss of purchasing power of the dollar. That is a triple whammy that could lead to massively higher prices. And the only way it doesn't is if we have a major disruption, global disruption, major systemic depressionary, deflationary depression. That's the only way this thing doesn't happen this way. And it's the same thing with food. We got larger population. We have government policies in the US that discourage farmers from producing food, that pay them not to produce. And then we've got a currency unit that is diminishing in purchasing power. Combine all them, this is prescription for a global disaster.
Yeah, it is. And energy and food are actually more closely related than you might think, because natural gas, the thing that's really spiking right now, is used to make synthetic fertilizer. And the fact that natural gas is spiking means there's a potential shortage of fertilizer out there, which impacts food production from a different direction. You know, from all the other problems with the supply chain and everything for food, now you've got potentially a shortage of fertilizer, which means a big cutback in food production. Now, I don't remember who it is that's got to cull hogs because they can't come up with enough food to feed their pigs, I think. And so somebody's getting ready to kill a whole bunch of pigs before it was normally time to take them to slaughter because of these supply disruptions. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of things that will impact food prices going forward.
Oh, yes.
And that's the food, rising food prices are what caused all the civil unrest, which led to the
Arab Spring.
Yes, the Arab Spring. Yeah, all the overthrowing of governments that happened over the last few years in the Middle East began with food shortages. So, which makes sense, right? Because if weird things are going on out there, but you've got enough to eat, you tend to let it pass over you. But as soon as you don't have enough to eat, your kids don't have enough to eat, then you're going to be highly likely to take some kind of action to bring about some kind of change. And to the extent that food shortages are going to be prevalent in this coming cold winter when there might be energy shortages at the same time, who knows what happens? It could be one of those really messy moments in history when a lot of things come together to lead a lot of people out into the streets who normally wouldn't have been out there.
Hey, one other thing going way up in price. Are you ready for this one? Water, because 50% of the cost of delivering water to your home is energy. All right. And if they need to start desalinizing more water because we have water shortages all over the West, and that's the only way you can satisfy that demand, desalinized water is even higher in energy usage and prices will go even higher. So plus they have to be built. They're capital intensive. We don't have them. I think there's one or two in California, a couple of other places in the country, not enough water. And that's the quadruple whammy of higher CapEx to deliver that water. I don't mean to be the doom and gloomer. There's still a lot of things to be optimistic about, but all these factors are converging. Hey, Evergrande driving up China gold demand and India's gold imports surging. Haven't seen this in a while. All things, because I'll tell you, when I went to China, everybody was investing in real estate because they were like 20 years behind us that believed real estate prices always go up. Now they're finding out otherwise.
There's an amazing chart, which stop me if we already talked about this in the last time we did a show, but it shows the percentage of household wealth that's attributed to real estate. And in the US, it's like 30%, which is a big number and not a surprise because we're a house-centric culture. But in China, it's like 75%. They put all their money into real estate. And now they've got a gigantic real estate developer going bust, which is taking down a lot of the other big real estate developers. So I think the Chinese government, they're trying not to bail out Evergrande right now, but I think it could get to the point where they have to bail out their whole real estate sector, which is, that's probably an order of magnitude as a percentage of GDP bigger than the bailouts we did after the Great Recession of the big banks. So this could be yet another thing that has just gotten started. You know, the Evergrande thing is nowhere near its completion because there are so many other moving parts to the story, and some of them are really, you know, very scary. And China, second biggest economy in the world, whatever happens there matters to everybody else.
Absolutely. And their real estate market's larger than the United States, $60 trillion sector, maybe as large. I thought the US 45 trillion. I could be wrong about that. But the other thing is that the quality of the structures being built in China, they call them tofu buildings, and they just fall apart rapidly. The quality is really, really bad. There's a couple of guys on motorcycles driving around China, exploring the country, and they show buildings built like 3-4 years before that are like in shambles. And nobody's in them either, but everybody's buying them. They can't get decent rents there because they have all this excess supply. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens. Anyway, that is it for today. Make sure you go over to dollarcollapse.com, sign up for John's newsletter. Same goes for FSN. Sign up for our newsletter. John, we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
See you, Kerry.